Dear USG, dear Rabab Fatima, dear Excellencies and friends, let me first express my regrets not to be able to be with you to exchange directly on this important topic. The key objectives of this meeting are indeed very important, as are the key questions we are invited to address. Promoting the MVI is a welcome means to integrating the needs of vulnerable countries into the agenda of the FFD4. 10 years ago at Addis Ababa, the question was already clearly posed, and followingly several initiatives have been taken in this regard, while at the same time the vulnerability in its various dimensions has become more crucial and a more urgent issue. Actually, the international financial institutions have introduced various modalities or innovation to address vulnerability in their financing mechanism. Special windows for fragile state, facilities to compensate for shocks, and so on. A lot of things have been done, but what is featuring the whole set of these measures, which are dispersed and not fully transparent for the countries concerned, is one, they are more curative than preventive. Two, they are not tackling the structural vulnerability of our countries in its various dimensions: economic, climatic, social. Three, they do not differentiate enough their support according to the respective degree of vulnerability of the different countries. And this is the reason why they do not use an index such as the MVI, and why a more comprehensive and preventive approach needs to use it. So, what is really missing is to quantitatively take into account structural vulnerability in the access to concessional financing, thanks to an appropriate index. With this regard, the adoption of the MVI by the UNGA, which recommends its use by financial institutions, marks a strong step in the will to fill what is missing. And I should add that it is in line with the MDB's vision statement adopted at the 2023 Paris Summit for a new global financing pact, inviting inter alia the MDBs to consider vulnerability for the access to concessional funding, while they say taking into account the work of the UN. But there is still a long way to go to bring the practice of the international financial institution closer to the wishes expressed by the UNGA. The preparation of the FFD4 is a good opportunity to move in this direction by building on the dialogue, a dialogue already underway. Let me just recall that in October 2023, during the annual meetings of the Bretton Woods Institution in Marrakesh, we have organized with two World Bank executive directors and with the participation of the USG, of UNHLS, and two vice president of the main MDBs in charge of concessional funds, a meeting to discuss this issue, the access to concessional financing according to vulnerability. And it is this dialogue that must now be continued and deepened at an operational level. There are several reasons to move quickly in this direction. One is, of course, today, the opportunity offered by the preparation of the FERDI, but the recent risk of a drastic reduction in the volume of concessional financing raises more than ever the problem of its allocation between countries. Second, in spite of a robust academic world, stakeholders still need to be convinced of the rationale of a reform relying on an appropriate index and consisting of taking into account the structural vulnerability. And that I should underline, both for eligibility to concessional financing and even more for its allocation between countries. Let me say, a recent study by FERDI has shown that the ODA presently allocated by MDBs to individual countries is not significantly correlated to their MVI or similar index. Three, the reform is not only desirable, it is also feasible, as it has been shown by the fact that some MDBs, such as the Caribbean one, already use an index in their allocation formula, that the European Union itself has been doing so for 10 years, even if it's not with the best indices, which legitimates the use of a kind of MVI. For institutions that already use a vulnerability index for allocation purposes, and even more for those that are invited to do so, we can only hope they will refer to the MVI in a flexible way, as a living tool, according to their objective and mandate. In other words, to use an index in the spirit of the MVI. Granted that it is based on these three fundamental principles: to be multidimensional, universal, and exogenous, what means to have a structural character. The issue is now how MDBs that do not yet do so can agree to introduce a structural vulnerability index into their allocation formula, which is, as you know, the performance-based allocation, and to move towards what I should call a performance and vulnerability-based allocation. But for that we have to face three objections, often heard and likely to be raised even more in the current international context. And I am convinced that an adequate formulation of the PBA must make it possible. One is a strong commitment of donors to the criterion of performance. Not to be discussed here, but what is important to show is that the addition of vulnerability in the formula will not necessarily reduce the relevant impact of performance on allocation. And we have shown that in the past in the case of the African Development Fund. Two, another is a fear that the addition of the vulnerability indicator will lead to diverting part of the allocation to the benefit of vulnerable middle-income countries and to the detriment of LDCs and low-income countries. To answer quickly, the most vulnerable in middle-income countries are very small countries whose allocation can be increased through the enlarged eligibility without a significant impact on the rest of the allocation. And second, and more important, is that if the PBA is applied in its current formulation, the marginal impact of the vulnerability on allocation is higher the lower the per capita income. The third objection, political objection, is that of a moral hazard that will result from the inclusion of a vulnerability indicator in the allocation formula, namely the risk that the recipient countries weaken their effort to lower their vulnerability. This objection is not founded, insofar as the vulnerability index is well built as being clearly independent of the present policy. It's a principle of exogeneity. It is a structural indicator. This question, seemingly technical, raises the issue of the criteria for the allocation of concessional funds, which should be addressed in the Civil Declaration. On this issue, the position of the member countries, in particular the recipient countries, should be taken into account, as it has already been expressed in various fora, Doha, Paris Summit, Marrakesh meeting, and here at the previous Preparatory Committee. And it has been done with the support of FERDI, still committed to do it. Thank you.